United Airlines Flight 482 from Chicago to Los Angeles was about to become a nightmare. Sarah Mitchell, a 27-year-old woman dressed in a cheap sweater and faded jeans, was sleeping peacefully in her economy seat when suddenly the plane began shaking violently. The engines emitted a terrifying noise. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, and panic exploded among the 350 passengers on board. Captain James Rodriguez, with 30 years of flying experience, realized they were rapidly losing altitude and that the control systems were no longer responding. In a moment of desperation, he grabbed the microphone and shouted something no one expected. Everyone looked around confused, while Sarah slowly opened her eyes. What no one knew was that this apparently poor and insignificant woman was hiding a secret that would save everyone's life. She had been the best fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force before a tragic event forever changed the course of her existence. Sarah Mitchell clutched the airline ticket she had bought with the last $500 in her checking account. It was an economy seat, row 34 by the window, on United Airlines Flight 482 from Chicago O'Hare to Los Angeles LAX. She wore a gray wool sweater bought at a thrift store, jeans showing signs of wear, and sneakers that had seen better days. At 27, Sarah had the appearance of a young woman whom life had severely tested. Her long brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, without makeup, to hide the tired face of someone who had slept little and eaten even less in recent months. She carried only a small canvas bag containing everything she owned: a few clothes, a worn book, and a photo she never looked at, but couldn't bring herself to throw away. The other passengers barely noticed her. She was the type of person who goes unnoticed, who doesn't attract attention, who seems to blend into the background. Businessmen in expensive suits checked their phones, wealthy families organized their vacations, affluent tourists browsed luxury magazines. Sarah was simply one of many people traveling in economy class, probably a migrant worker seeking fortune. What no one could imagine was that until 3 years ago, Sarah Mitchell had been Captain Sarah Mitchell of the U.S. Air Force, a fighter pilot with over 2,000 hours flying F-22 Raptors, decorated for valor, considered one of the best pilots of her generation. She had flown international missions, saved human lives, represented America in NATO exercises, requiring nerves of steel and absolute precision. But that was before the accident, before a routine mission went wrong due to an unpredictable technical failure, before her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, lost his life in a crash she couldn't prevent, before a military inquiry board, while recognizing no technical fault, decided she was emotionally unfit for active service after the trauma she suffered. 3 years of therapy, 3 years of nightmares, 3 years trying to forget Marcus's face as his fighter plummeted into the Pacific. Sarah had lost everything: her career, her salary, her base housing, but most importantly, she had lost herself. She had become a shadow of the brave and determined woman she once was. Now she was flying to Los Angeles because her cousin Maria, who managed a small Mexican restaurant in East LA, had offered her a job as a waitress. It wasn't much, but it was the only opportunity she had to start over, far from the memories and uniforms that reminded her of who she had been. As the plane taxied down the runway at O'Hare for takeoff, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to relax. The sound of engines, which had once been music to her ears, now only caused anxiety. Every vibration, every change in speed made her jump. It was ironic. One of America's best pilots, who was afraid of flying as a passenger. Captain James Rodriguez announced that the flight would last 5 hours, and weather conditions were favorable. Sarah pulled out her book, adjusted the pillow behind her head, and tried to focus on reading. She had learned that the only way to endure flights was to distract herself, not think about what was happening in the cockpit. But as the plane climbed over the Great Lakes, Sarah couldn't know that soon she would be called to return to what she did best, flying, and that, this time, instead of a military mission, it would be about saving the lives of 350 innocent people, including her own. Fate was about to test Sarah Mitchell one last time, and she had no idea she was ready to face it. 4 hours had passed since the flight began when the first sign of trouble manifested. Sarah was sleeping deeply, finally relaxed after taking an anxiety pill her psychologist had prescribed. It was one of the few moments when she could find peace, when her mind wasn't tormented by memories of the past. In the cockpit, Captain James Rodriguez was checking flight parameters with his co-pilot, First Officer David Martinez. They were at cruising altitude, 36,000 feet over the Rocky Mountains, halfway between Chicago and Los Angeles. Everything was proceeding normally when suddenly the control monitors began flashing with alarm signals. Captain Rodriguez, 52 years old, had flown for 30 years without ever facing a serious emergency. He was an experienced and respected pilot, had trained dozens of younger co-pilots, but what he was seeing on his instruments he had never experienced before. Hydraulic systems showed abnormal pressures, the onboard computer signaled multiple errors, and most worrying was a disturbing noise coming from the left engine. First Officer Martinez checked emergency manuals, while Rodriguez attempted to stabilize the aircraft. But the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The noise from the left engine became a frightening metallic scream, then suddenly stopped completely. The plane began tilting to the left and losing altitude. It was at that moment Sarah woke with a start. Her body, trained by years of military flying, immediately recognized something was wrong. The aircraft's angle of inclination was incorrect, the wing vibration was abnormal, and most importantly, there was an ominous silence where engine noise should be. Around her, passengers were beginning to realize something was wrong. Flight attendants tried to maintain calm, but Sarah saw in their eyes the same concern growing in her stomach. A child began crying. A businessman tried calling his wife. An elderly couple held hands, praying quietly. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom, tense but still controlled, announcing technical difficulties and asking everyone to remain seated with seat belts fastened. But Sarah understood, from the tone and terminology used, that the situation was much more serious than the captain wanted to admit. Her military training had taught her to decipher codes and euphemisms used by pilots in emergencies. 10 minutes later, the plane began shaking violently. The right engine started making irregular noises, indicating it was also having problems. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling like yellow rain, and panic erupted in the cabin. Sarah put on her oxygen mask with automatic, perfect movements that betrayed years of training. She looked around and saw terror in passengers' eyes. Families embracing, believing they were living their last moments. Businessmen finally understanding their money couldn't save them. Children crying without understanding why their parents were so frightened. It was then she heard the captain's desperate voice through the intercom. The silence that followed was deafening. 350 people holding their breath, hoping someone, anyone, could help them. Sarah felt her heart beating so hard it seemed about to explode. She had sworn to herself never to fly again, never to touch aircraft controls again. Memories of Marcus, his terrified face in his final moments, still tormented her every night. But looking at those innocents around her, hearing the child's crying in the row ahead, seeing a mother whispering comfort to her baby, Sarah Mitchell understood that fate was giving her one last chance. Not for herself, but to save all those lives that depended on her. With trembling hands, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood from her seat. The moment had come to discover if she still had the courage to be the pilot she once was. Sarah walked toward the front of the plane with firm steps, ignoring the turbulence that made the cabin oscillate. Passengers watched her with curiosity mixed with hope. This woman of insignificant appearance, who now seemed to possess a determination that contrasted with her modest clothing. A flight attendant named Jessica stopped her before she reached the cockpit door. She was a young woman, about 25, trying to maintain professional calm, but her eyes betrayed terror. When Sarah identified herself as a U.S. Air Force captain with 2,000 hours flying military jets, the attendant looked at her incredulously. This woman in jeans and cheap sweater didn't resemble her idea of a military pilot. But something in Sarah's tone of voice, in the confidence of her movements, convinced her to let her pass. Sarah knocked on the cockpit door using the standard code every professional pilot knows. First Officer Martinez appeared with his face marked by tension, and when Sarah introduced herself as a military pilot, Captain Rodriguez turned with skepticism. He saw a young woman of ordinary appearance, certainly not what he expected. But he had no choice. When Rodriguez asked for confirmation of her experience, Sarah responded with military precision, listing flight hours, certifications, and extreme emergency training. Rodriguez quickly explained the situation. Left engine completely lost, right at 60%, hydraulic systems compromised, constant altitude loss. The nearest airport was Denver, but with current parameters, they would never make it that far. Sarah looked at the instruments, and immediately her brain began calculating speed, altitude, fuel consumption, aircraft weight. It was as if all the years of training returned to the surface, momentarily canceling traumas and fears. She analyzed the situation with professional calm. They had about 20 minutes before losing complete control. They needed to reduce weight by dumping fuel and find the nearest airport, but first modify flight attitude to compensate for asymmetric thrust loss. Captain Rodriguez watched in amazement as she analyzed the situation with precision that he, with all his experience, was struggling to maintain. When Sarah asked to intervene on the controls, Rodriguez hesitated only a moment before making room for her. Sarah sat in the co-pilot seat and began touching controls with sure and precise movements. Her hands moved on the controls like those of a pianist on a piano, every movement calculated and perfect. Immediately, the aircraft began to stabilize. Sarah had compensated for thrust loss by adjusting flaps, modifying rudder angle and reducing speed to optimize lift-to-drag ratio. It was a complex maneuver requiring years of experience and nerves of steel. First Officer Martinez whispered incredulously, wondering who this woman was. Sarah didn't respond, completely focused on flight parameters, calculating the optimal trajectory to reach Denver International Airport, the only place where they could attempt an emergency landing. But she knew even so, it would be an almost impossible feat. While working the controls, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't experienced in 3 years. There was no room for memories of Marcus, for guilt, for fears. There was only her, the aircraft, and the sky. She had returned to being what she always was, a falcon dominating the air.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
But the most difficult test was yet to come, because landing a commercial aircraft with one engine out and compromised systems required much more than technical skill. It required courage that Sarah believed she had lost forever. Sarah communicated with Denver Air Traffic Control while maintaining the aircraft in a controlled glide toward Denver International Airport. Her voice was calm and professional, but behind that facade, her heart was beating furiously. Every instinct from military service told her that what they were attempting was at the limit of impossible. A commercial aircraft with one engine out, compromised hydraulic systems, and over 300 people aboard wasn't like flying a military fighter. Captain Rodriguez watched incredulously as Sarah coordinated the emergency with precision he had never seen in 30 years of career. She calculated descent angles, managed fuel consumption, communicated with air traffic control, and simultaneously explained to him and the co-pilot every maneuver she was executing. She explained they needed to descend to 10,000 feet, maintaining 180 knots. With only one engine functioning at 60%, they had a practically non-existent margin of error. One wrong maneuver, and they would stall. In the passenger cabin, tension was palpable. Flight attendants had explained they were making an emergency landing, and everyone needed to assume safety position. Families prayed, businessmen wrote final messages, elderly couples held hands, accepting what might be their fate. Sarah felt the weight of all those lives on her shoulders. It was the same feeling as combat missions, but multiplied by 100. She wasn't protecting just herself, but hundreds of innocents who had placed their trust in her. She communicated with Denver Control. They were 15 miles from the airport, altitude 8,000 feet, speed 170 knots. They requested runway clear and all available emergency services. The response was positive. Runway 34 right clear. Ambulances and fire trucks in position. Sarah looked through the windscreen and saw Denver International's lights shining in the Colorado darkness. It was a major airport with long runways, their only hope of salvation. But with one engine, the landing maneuver would be extremely delicate, requiring perfect precision. She instructed Captain Rodriguez. At 500 feet altitude, he needed to communicate to passengers to immediately assume emergency position. They wouldn't have time for gradual warnings. At 3,000 feet altitude, Sarah began the final landing sequence. She lowered landing gear, extended flaps to maximum, compensated for the aircraft's tendency to turn toward the dead engine side. Her movements were fluid and precise, as if she were performing a deadly dance with physics and gravity. The co-pilot announced 500 feet. Captain Rodriguez shouted through the intercom the order for emergency position for everyone. Sarah saw the runway approaching rapidly. It was long enough for a Boeing 737, but with one engine the approach had to be perfect. Even a minor calculation error could be catastrophic. She felt the immense pressure of 350 lives, depending on the precision of her movements. At 100 feet from ground, a crosswind gust made the aircraft oscillate. Sarah compensated instinctively, correcting trajectory with small, precise movements. It was the moment she had feared most. She had to completely trust her instinct and experience. Ground contact was hard, but controlled. The tires touched asphalt with a deafening noise. The aircraft bounced slightly, then stabilized on the runway. Sarah immediately engaged brakes and reverse thrust from the functioning engine, fighting to stop 350 tons of metal before runway's end. The aircraft stopped with plenty of runway remaining. For a few seconds there was unreal silence. Then the loudest applause Sarah had ever heard erupted. She had done the impossible. She had saved 350 lives. But most importantly, she had saved herself. The hours following the landing were a whirlwind of emotions, interviews, and recognition Sarah had never desired. Passengers sought her out to thank her. Journalists wanted to interview the flight's heroine. Airport authorities treated her like a celebrity. But all Sarah wanted was to disappear. She had taken refuge in Denver International's VIP lounge, still dressed in her cheap sweater and faded jeans, trying to process what had just happened. For the first time in 3 years, she had taken aircraft controls. And not only had she managed to fly without having a panic attack, but she had also saved hundreds of lives. Captain Rodriguez joined her with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her in silence. He was a man of few words, but his eyes expressed gratitude beyond any verbal thanks. He confessed that in 30 years he had never seen anything like it. She had done what he never could have accomplished. A pilot with her abilities should be commanding first class for the world's most important airlines. Sarah looked out the window, where dawn was painting the Colorado sky with pink and gold hues. Her story was too complicated to tell a stranger, even if that stranger owed her his life. She explained simply that she had stopped flying 3 years earlier, believing she was no longer capable. Rodriguez replied that she was wrong. What she had done was extraordinary. She was born to fly. In the following hours, Sarah discovered that news of her heroic intervention had already reached across America. News programs spoke of the mysterious pilot who had saved the United Flight. Social media was full of passenger photos and videos, and most importantly, the U.S. Air Force had begun asking questions. Colonel Michael Thompson, who had been her commander before the accident, called her personally. He had heard what she had done. The entire country was talking about her. It was time to come home. But Sarah wasn't ready to return. She wasn't ready to face the memories, to put on a uniform again, to return to being the person she was before losing Marcus. What she had done on the aircraft was instinct, an automatic reaction to emergency. It didn't mean she was healed from trauma. She decided to stay in Denver for a few days, guest of the airline that wanted to thank her for saving one of their aircraft. It was the first time in 3 years she allowed herself a break, that she didn't have to worry about paying rent or finding the next job. One evening, while walking through downtown Denver, Sarah received an unexpected phone call. It was from Linda Johnson, Marcus's sister. She had seen the news and told her that Marcus would have been proud of her. Those words broke the emotional barrier Sarah had built around her heart. For the first time in 3 years, she cried. She cried for Marcus, for herself, for all the years lost hiding from life. But she also cried with relief because she finally understood that saving those people on the aircraft hadn't been just luck or training. It had been love. Love for life, for flying, for the sense of responsibility that had always guided her actions. Marcus hadn't died because of her fault, and she didn't have to spend the rest of her life punishing herself for a tragedy she couldn't have prevented. That night, looking at stars over the Rocky Mountains, Sarah Mitchell made the most important decision of her life. It was time to return to flying. Not to hide from the past, but to build a future worthy of Marcus's sacrifice and the miracle she had accomplished, saving 350 innocents. The Falcon was ready to spread its wings again. 6 months after the miraculous landing in Denver, Sarah Mitchell found herself again in a cockpit. But this time it wasn't an emergency. She was the captain of the inaugural flight for American Heritage Airlines, which had hired her as chief pilot after hearing her story. She wore an impeccable navy blue uniform with golden shoulder boards indicating her captain rank, and hair pulled back in a perfect bun. She was completely different from the disheveled-looking woman who 6 months earlier was sleeping in economy class. But the biggest change was in her eyes. They had returned to shine with the determination and passion that had always characterized them. Sarah's story had become legend in world aviation. She had received medals from the president, international recognition, job offers from the most prestigious airlines worldwide. But most importantly, she had found herself again. She had returned to therapy, not to hide from trauma, but to process it constructively. She had visited Marcus's grave for the first time in 3 years, bringing him a Valor Medal she had received and telling him about all the lives she had saved. She understood that honoring his memory meant continuing to fly, not stopping. The Air Force had offered her return to active duty with a promotion, but Sarah had chosen civil aviation. She wanted to dedicate her life to bringing people home safely, to making travel dreams and family reunions possible. It was her way of transforming trauma into life mission. That day, she was piloting the inaugural flight from Denver to Los Angeles, the same route she was traveling as a passenger when everything changed. But this time she was in command, with an experienced co-pilot named Jake Wilson, who looked at her with admiration and respect. Before takeoff, Sarah made a special announcement to passengers. She briefly told her story, explained how a moment of difficulty had taken her away from flying, and how another emergency had brought her home. She spoke of second chances, of how sometimes life tests us precisely to show us what we're capable of. Among the passengers was James Rodriguez, the captain who 6 months earlier had launched the desperate call for help. Now he flew as a simple passenger, going into retirement after declaring that after seeing Sarah in action, he felt ready to leave the skies in better hands than his. There was also flight attendant Jessica, who had begun studying to become a pilot inspired by Sarah's example. And there were many passengers from Flight 482 who had specifically chosen to fly with the woman who had saved their lives. Takeoff was perfect, as Sarah's flights always were. As the aircraft rose above the Rockies and headed toward the Pacific, she looked at the infinite sky ahead and thought of Marcus, not with pain, but with gratitude. He had taught her that flying didn't just mean mastering machines, but taking care of people. And now every flight was a way to honor that lesson. 5 hours later, when the aircraft gently touched LAX runway, Sarah felt the same peace she had experienced that terrible day in Denver. She was no longer a pilot fleeing her past, but a commander who had transformed trauma into wisdom, fear into courage, loss into mission. As passengers applauded and thanked her for the perfect flight, Sarah understood that her true victory hadn't been saving 350 lives in one night. It had been saving herself every day since then, choosing not to give up, not to let pain win over passion. The Falcon had not only resumed flying, she had learned to fly higher than before, carrying with her the wisdom that comes only from overcoming the darkest storms. And every time she looked at the sky, she knew Marcus was flying beside her, proud of the courageous woman she had become. Because sometimes you have to lose everything to discover who you really are. And sometimes it takes a moment of terror to remind us we're made to be heroes, even when we think we've forgotten how. Like if you believe that inside each of us there's a hero, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Comment which part of the story moved you most. Share to inspire those struggling with their traumas and needing hope. Subscribe for more stories of courage, resilience, and second chances. Sometimes fate tests us precisely when we think we're no longer capable of passing the test. Sometimes our most important mission awaits us when we feel most lost. And sometimes it takes just one moment of courage to save not only others, but also ourselves. Because true heroes aren't those who have no fear, but those who find strength to act despite the fear.